Today we'll be talking about how to write a competitive grant proposal. This video comes along with a proposal writing guide, which is a living document with more detailed guidance particular to JPAL proposals. This video is the first in a series aimed at providing practical advice on conducting randomized evaluations in low and middle income countries. It offers advice on how to write a competitive grant proposal. While our advice applies most directly to JPAL proposals, this guidance will be helpful to any impact evaluation. Please note that while budgeting is a very important part of putting together a proposal, we do not have time to cover it in this video. We will share tips for preparing budgets in a subsequent video. It should be noted that in our proposal review process, we treat the budget separately from the proposal. In other words, we interrogate the intellectual value of the proposal before assessing the budget for feasibility. Please refer to our guidance on budgeting in our grant proposals research resource that we link to in the materials that are shared along with this video. JPAL provides three main types of grants. The first is for proposal development, sometimes also called travel grants. The second is for pilots, and the third is to fund full randomized control trials. The first two grants are smaller in value and are intended to fund exploratory work that will lead to an RCT. For example, you may use the funding to travel to meet implementing partners, run focus groups, conduct quantitative surveys, or test the uptake for the program. Regional scholars are eligible to apply for either proposal development or pilot grants at any time. Eligibility for a full RCT grant is extended once a JPAL-funded pilot has been successfully completed. In this video, we will focus primarily on proposals for pilots and full randomized control trials, but we will also briefly discuss pointers for proposal development grants. While there are differences in the proposal requirements across funding initiatives within JPAL, you will be able to find details on the respective initiative RFP pages. Writing these types of proposals is a skill that takes work and practice no matter where you are based or your area of focus. It pays off to start drafting grant proposals early to allow sufficient time for feedback from colleagues, mentors, or implementing partners. Don't give up if your first grant application is unsuccessful. Grant proposals from both more and less experienced researchers are often unsuccessful at first, especially when the proposal lacks sufficient clarity and detail. The review process at each organization can be idiosyncratic, and a revised proposal may be more successful in a subsequent funding round, or may be a better fit for a different donor. All grant proposals should answer three sets of questions. What? What is your research question? What is new? What is your contribution to the literature? What are your expected findings? Why? Why is the question interesting? Why is the answer consequential? Why isn't the answer obvious? And how? How do you proceed regarding the data? How do you proceed regarding the empirical strategy? How would this lead to a randomized evaluation? This is particular for proposal development grants and pilots. From a reviewer's perspective, it should be clear that both the implementation of the intervention and the research design are feasible. We will offer advice on how to demonstrate the feasibility of the proposed study in this video. Throughout this video, and in more detail in the associated document, we'll draw on examples from two successful JPAL grant proposals. First is a proposal funded by the Jobs and Opportunity Initiative for a pilot titled Planning for Productive Migration in Niger by Jeremy Weinstein, Darren Christensen, Alison Grossman, and Guy Grossman. The second is a full RCT funded by the Governance Initiative titled Women's Empowerment and Local Governance in Indonesia by Eitan Paul. So today we'll be talking through different stages and considerations throughout the different parts of a grant proposal. We'll start with the pre-proposal planning, then setting the scene. We will then discuss describing the intervention, the methodology, and the implementing partner and research team. Lastly, we'll conclude with some writing tips. Let's get started with pre-proposal planning, where we will look at all of the steps we need to take before beginning the process of writing. For JPAL and other bodies that focus on randomized evaluations, it is imperative that there is a clear pathway to a randomized control trial in proposals for early-stage exploratory projects. This is applicable to proposal development and pilot grants. In most cases, the study should aim to evaluate a program that is either brand new or being adapted or expanded. This is because this ensures that there is a large enough population to create a control group, which is a key requirement for an RCT. For new or adapted programs, a control group can be created without needing to withhold access to an existing program for some participants. In general, implementing partners are less likely to be willing to conduct a randomized evaluation of an existing program if they are confident that the program is effective, or if eligible participants have already come to expect that they can participate in this program. To ensure that the project and research team are a good fit for the grant, it is important to check the eligibility requirements and selection criteria. It is helpful to understand the priorities of the funder, outlined in the Request for Proposals, RFP. Please read the RFP and associated documents very carefully. Each RFP will highlight in detail what it is looking to fund and what questions fit. For example, a funding initiative may prioritize particular thematic areas, research questions, or countries. You should also be sure to check the relevant deadlines. Grants often have multiple parts with different deadlines, such as for an expression of interest and for a proposal. It's also important to check on necessary approvals. Both partner organizations and the lead institution will typically want to review your budget and planned activities in advance, so it is important to account for this in your planning. There are often 2 separate reviews for different purposes and are ideally done sequentially. The first review should be conducted by the implementing partner or the other project partners. This is to ensure that the proposal reflects your agreement on the study activities and the roles and responsibilities of those involved. The second review is conducted by the university of the lead applicant, typically by an Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. In some instances, this office may submit the application on your behalf, depending on your university's processes, so be sure to account for this in your grant preparation timeline. The time they request will vary by institution. For example, the University of Ghana requires professors applying for external grants to complete a research support request form, which can take up to 2 weeks to process. In addition, if the research team includes researchers from multiple universities, some universities may require a research collaboration agreement between institutions in order to govern data sharing and management. The process of getting administrators from multiple institutions to sign this agreement can be quite lengthy. Be sure to factor in the time required to obtain these additional layers of approval. The proposal will need to include letters of support from any close partners, such as the organization implementing the program, or any organizations helping run the evaluation of the program. Note that this does not include consultants or contractors hired for a narrow role. Letters of support also aren't needed for proposal development grants, where you may be using the grant to establish these relationships. It's important to have agreements in place with any organization receiving a subaward or whose collaboration is critical to the project's success. This includes a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, between the lead institution and the organization in charge of data collection, such as the local JPAL or IPA office. Letters of support submitted as part of your proposal help demonstrate the project's feasibility and indicate partner buy-in, which are important criteria assessed by the reviewers. Next, we turn to setting the scene for your research project, where you explain the motivation for the project and why this research is important. Your proposal should begin with a clear problem statement that speaks to the motivation of your study. It should be succinct and to the point. For example, ATAL's proposal on women's empowerment and local governance in Indonesia begins with the following. Women's interests remain underrepresented in local policymaking despite the implementation of community-based and participatory planning and budgeting programs in much of the developing world. Preliminary research in Indonesia suggests that male dominance in neighborhood institutions may make it difficult for women's voices to be heard, even if female attendance quotas in village planning and budgeting meetings are met. The motivation section sets the scene by describing challenges in the context of the study taking place, which the intervention aims to address. The contextual factors that motivate the intervention should be supported by data and findings from prior research, which could include statistics from government agencies and prior research conducted by the research team members. For funders like JPAL, policy relevance and paths to scale are especially important. Therefore, in the motivation in your study, it is helpful to outline how the question addresses an important policy issue in your context and how findings can inform policy decisions and/or the intervention could potentially be scaled up if found to be effective. Some common mistakes to avoid in this section are including a long literature review. While you should refer to the related literature in the section on your study's contribution to the literature, you should aim to be as concise and to the point as possible. As a tentative guide, this could be half a page. You should also avoid including statements that are not backed up with data. You should back up your statements with evidence such as summary statistics from the country in question. Next, we turn to the research question. It is important to directly state your question and show how it fits into the literature and the field. The question should be understandable and compelling to researchers outside of your subdiscipline, and it should clearly demonstrate the relevance to the policy community. It should also be narrow and specific enough so that you can appropriately answer it with your proposed project. It should also clearly respond to the eligible themes and topics in the request for proposals. For example, the proposal on women's participation in policymaking, which was submitted to a fund that prioritizes research on political participation, states the research question as follows. Can trainings on women's empowerment and gender inclusion for 1. Neighborhood-level voice groups and 2. Neighborhood association leaders increase women's participation and representation in Indonesian neighborhoods? Next, let's discuss the contribution of your proposed study to the literature. As in an academic paper, a literature review in a grant proposal should contextualize your research question and show that your proposed study fills an important gap. You can achieve this by showing that you know the relevant literature on your study's topic, by citing important papers, and by stating explicitly where the gaps are and how your study will fill them. In demonstrating the contribution of your study vis-a-vis existing research, it is important not to disparage prior research. Instead, you can highlight the ways in which your research will extend or complement existing work. Peer-reviewed journals, working paper series, reputable think tanks, and research organizations are good sources for finding papers to include in the literature review. Be sure to only include relevant studies. This could include studies that seek to answer questions that are the same as or similar to the question you study, even if it's conducted in a different location, or studies that provide support to your theory or methodology. While important, do not spend the bulk of your proposal on this section. The literature review should be concise, to the point, and need not be exhaustive. It is the intervention and research design, not your discussion of other researchers' work, that should be the focus. Next, let's discuss how you will describe your proposed intervention. We will start with the theory of change. The description of the intervention should also include discussion of the theory of change, also known as TOC. The TOC describes how you expect the program to affect the outcomes you will measure. It is an important element to include because it lays out the causal chain of the intervention and the assumptions that need to hold for that causal chain to be realized. Part of laying out the TOC includes identifying the assumptions that you are making behind the causal chain and the risks that exist that might prevent it from being realized. When you are evaluating a program that already exists, the TOC may have been laid out by the implementing partner. Alternatively, if you are evaluating an intervention that you helped design, you will be part of the team that constructs the TOC. In either case, it is important to include the TOC in your proposal. This is an illustration of a theory of change in the form of a directed acyclic graph. You don't necessarily need to present a theory of change in such a detailed way in your proposal, but this is a nice example of what a more fleshed out version might look like. Note that detailed TOCs are typically not required for proposal development grants because the research is still at an early stage, and you may be using the grant to develop the theory of change for your intervention. It is important to provide sufficient detail about the intervention to convince the reviewers that your study is feasible and that your findings will be reliable and answer the question that you are asking. This comprises two separate but equally important components. Firstly, a clear description of what the intervention is. That is, what does the actual program involve or deliver to the recipients? Secondly, a clear description of the logistics involved by the implementing partner in delivering the intervention in the context of a randomized evaluation, as well as why you believe these logistics are feasible for the partner. This is important because in your proposal, you are first convincing the review board that the partner is credible in running a well-thought-out program. Secondly, you're convincing the review board that your study design makes sense and is feasible. In the case of a new program, you are also convincing the reviewers that the implementing partner's plan is feasible. The review board will be looking out for research that will fail because the underlying program wasn't well designed, won't plausibly affect the outcomes, or won't have sufficient take-up to be evaluated. Note that this advice is applicable for both pilot and full-scale RCTs, but not for proposal development grants. For studies with multiple treatment arms and/or a placebo group, the distinguishing features of each treatment arm should be clearly described, in addition to a description of the primary treatment. The treatment arms should be described both programmatically and in terms of what specific research question the different arms and comparisons across arms will answer. Details about the intervention will help reviewers understand the relevance of the study and whether the outcomes, which will be described later in the proposal, are appropriate measures of the intervention's impact. Schematics like this one, which show how the intervention will be provided to whom, in what order, and when, can be effective for conveying to the reader how complex interventions will operate. For proposal development and pilot grants, the proposal should describe the preliminary research activities and how these activities will inform the research design of a full RCT that comes afterwards. It is important to review the RFP to see if there is a preference for particular types of pilot research activities. For example, some JPAL initiatives prefer that pilots be used to test take-up of an intervention or factors that drive take-up. This is so that when you progress to a full RCT, you can ensure that take-up is sufficiently high for you to detect an effect. Take-up directly affects the power of your study. Initiatives may also want pilots to practice the logistics of the intervention with the partner in order to make sure they can actually deliver the program. This is especially important for new programs that have not been implemented before. A proposal development grant is for a research idea that is at a very early stage. You have an idea of an intervention and possible evaluation, but you still need to collect some qualitative or quantitative data to test your idea, to build relationships with implementing partners, or travel to areas where the intervention would take place. The Weinstein et al. Proposal is a great example of the kind of detail that you should include in a pilot proposal. They specified that they would use the pilot funding to test all elements of the intervention, estimate the rate of program take-up, deploy, test, and refine protocols to minimize attrition, measure short-term outcomes of the program, and test measures in the field that are designed to ensure fidelity to the intervention and research design. This proposal also clearly lays out the timeline of these activities and mentions other activities which are already underway. You can read the full description included in their proposal in the accompanying grant proposal guidance document. Next, let's discuss the methodology section of the proposal, beginning with the experimental design. You'll want to explain your research design, including the details of the experimental design. This is the most important part of your proposal, so don't skimp on details in this section. In this section, you would include information such as the number of treatment arms, the intervention each treatment arm will receive, the unit at which you are randomizing, and the sample size. Note that for pilots, some of these details may still be uncertain, and for proposal development grants, you might not know any of this yet. That's okay. Include what you can at these exploratory stages. In the accompanying grant proposal guidance document, you will find an example of an experimental design taken from the Paul proposal, which explains different interventions that are received by a placebo group and 2 treatment arms. The randomization procedure should also be described. For example, will randomization be weighted to place more units in the control group? Are there cross-cutting treatments? Does the experiment use a phase-in or encouragement design? Will you stratify? And what is your unit of analysis? Your design choices should be described and accompanied by theoretical or contextual justifications. Note that how your implementing partner can deliver the program will affect the type of experimental design that is feasible and most appropriate. For more information on these different types of experimental designs, see the JPAL research resource on randomization and JPAL North America's Real-World Challenges to Randomization and Their Solutions resource, which we link to in the proposal guidance document. Next, you should state your key hypotheses and outcomes and how you will measure them. For short grant proposals, such as those used by JPAL, the hypotheses and outcomes don't have to be as specific as they would be in a pre-analysis plan. However, they should still specify what outcomes you expect the treatment to affect and where the data to measure these outcomes will come from. It's important to make sure you describe the data you will use to measure the outcomes listed in each hypothesis. If you will use administrative data, describe how you will get access to the data and what specific measures from the administrative data set will be used to test each hypothesis. If you have already gained access or permission to access the data, it will strengthen your proposal to mention this, as it indicates buy-in from your research partners. It may also be helpful to comment on the expected reliability of the administrative data set. If you will use survey data, you should describe when and how the survey will be conducted, and by whom if you already know which survey firm you intend to work with. In longer grant proposals and in pre-analysis plans, one would also specify which survey questions will be used to test each hypothesis. You should also specify the study timeline and a justification for that timeline. For example, if the end survey will be conducted 1 year after the treatment is delivered, why should we expect to see results observable within this time period, and would we expect the results to persist over a longer time horizon? The justification may cite results from existing related research. Less experienced researchers often underestimate the time and cost required to collect data for pilots and full-scale RCTs. It is helpful to consult experienced implementing partners and researchers who have done research in similar contexts to get a realistic sense of approximately how long each stage of the study may take to implement and how much each research activity will cost. Drawing on your theory of change, it is helpful to set up tests of mechanisms that can provide evidence of how or why the treatment causes or fails to cause its desired effects. For example, let's consider a simplified version of the Paul proposal. Here, we hypothesize that an increased sense of self-efficacy and community efficacy, combined with improved knowledge of local governance processes, leads to greater empowerment in decision-making and increased engagement in decision-making. So, in this case, our hypothesized mechanism is that attitudes plus knowledge will lead to a change in behavior. In order to test this, we must measure attitudes, knowledge, and behavior. If we find that all three change, this would constitute evidence in favor of the hypothesized mechanism. Alternatively, if, for example, the study finds positive effects for efficacy and participation outcomes, but not knowledge, this would suggest that increasing knowledge is not a necessary condition to increase participation. Other studies may test mechanisms by conducting mediation analysis, unbundling components into separate treatment arms, or through subgroup analysis. Evidence in Governance and Politics is a useful resource on this topic, titled 10 Things to Know About Mechanisms. You can also describe how contextual or demographic factors may moderate the effects of your intervention. For example, we might expect a women's empowerment treatment to be more effective in villages with female village heads. Or we might expect the treatment to make more of a difference for women with fewer years of schooling. Some proposals also describe plans for implementation monitoring in order to ensure that the intervention is implemented as planned. More information about implementation monitoring can be found in JPAL's research resource on this topic. Power calculations are required for full RCT proposals, but not typically required for proposal development grants or pilots. Note that in such proposals, you should provide an indication of the expected sample size in the follow-on RCT if possible. Power calculations should indicate the minimum detectable effects for the intended sample size, assumptions about take-up and compliance, variation of the outcome variable, the intercluster correlation coefficient, and your expected rates of attrition and survey response. It is helpful to justify these assumptions and contextualize the plausibility of the minimum detectable effect and take-up based on results of existing research. If the study analyzes outcomes with different units of analysis, for example the individual and the village, the power calculations should be conducted for both accordingly. For cluster randomized designs, power analyses should show how different levels of intercluster correlation would affect the minimum detectable effect for individual level outcomes. Pay particular attention to your assumptions and justifications for expected take-up, non-compliance, and attrition rates. Insufficient take-up, non-compliance, and attrition effectively reduce the sample size and increase the minimum detectable effect. It can be useful to convey the results of power calculations using a graph or table. Visuals can summarize clearly and concisely how power varies with changes in key parameters, such as effect size. For guidance, see JPAL's research resource on power calculations. In your proposal, you'll want to briefly describe the role and experience of implementing partners, such as government agencies, NGOs, or data collection partners, as well as members of the research team. In this section, you will describe the role and experience of implementing partners. These include the organizations running the program or intervention, like a government agency or NGO. They also include a partner you may be working with to implement the evaluation, for example, a survey and data collection team. The more experience your partners have with this kind of research, the more feasible your project. Remember that feasibility is a key criterion that the review board considers, so make sure to demonstrate the feasibility of your evaluation as much as possible. In addition to implementing partners, it may also be important to discuss the experience of research team members. This is especially relevant if researchers' CVs are not submitted as part of the application, and if researchers are not already known to or specifically invited by the funder. For example, a researcher who has not previously implemented an RCT, but has worked with the implementing partner on an observational study on a similar topic should discuss this experience and how it helped them prepare to design and implement this RCT. Junior researchers should also mention any relevant experience as a research assistant for an RCT, or taking courses on field experimental methods, such as courses from the online JPAL DEDP MicroMasters program. Lastly, let's discuss some writing tips. Firstly, it's a good idea to build a strong structure before you start writing. What is your main argument or point? You always want to have this in mind before anything else. Make sure it is highlighted early, clearly, and often. Always outline a piece of writing before you start. What are the sections, and what are the clear headers and subheaders? What information or pieces of data will go in each section? What is the appropriate length of each section? The first sentence of each paragraph is its topic sentence, and it should help the reader understand the main point of that paragraph without having to read every word. Anytime you switch topics, you should start a new paragraph. Secondly, use a clear title for your proposal. It should present your research in a clear and ideally eye-catching way. Here are some examples from projects JPAL has funded. When should government subsidize health? The case of mass deworming. Call Me Maybe, experimental evidence on using mobile phones to survey microenterprises. Risk sharing and transaction costs, evidence from Kenya's mobile money revolution. Each of these titles is linked to the paper in the proposal guidance document. Let's turn to the section where you cite related literature. This section is critical to help the reader better grasp your contribution to the literature. You want to ensure that you only cite and present papers that are closely linked to your research question. Make sure you use your own words and communicate clearly. Do not give the impression that you copy and pasted from previous papers. Explain how your work improves upon existing papers, but without making gratuitous negative remarks about them. For example, you shouldn't say, "The deficiency of X's approach is," or "the problem of these papers is," or "these papers suffer from X shortcomings." Rather, you could phrase it as, "We complement these approaches in a number of ways. First, we do this, second, we do this, and third, we do this." Our fourth tip is to use clear, concise language. Avoid the use of superlatives such as very, extremely, or highly. Write in active voice instead of passive voice. As a very simple example, this means saying, "I will do X," as opposed to "X will be done by me." Don't start sentences with the word "this" unless you follow it with the associated noun. For example, you would say, "This evidence indicates that XYZ," instead of saying, "This indicates that XYZ." Using this sentence structure will make your writing clear, more elegant, and more persuasive. Check paragraph breaks to make sure that each paragraph contains one and only one fully articulated idea. Readers are subconsciously looking for open space. As a consequence, no paragraph should be longer than half a page. Ideally, each full page will include more than 2 paragraphs. It is very helpful to reread your own proposal several times with the following questions in mind. Did you clearly identify the intervention you plan to study? And did you clearly identify the research plan for how you will study this intervention? Can you shorten the piece or cut unnecessary words? Did you write in active voice? Did you use superlatives unnecessarily? Was the structure of the piece clear? Try reading just the topic sentence in your piece. Can you understand the main message without reading more than just the topic sentence in each paragraph? Read each paragraph backwards, sentence by sentence, to see if you spot any grammatical mistakes. Lastly, ask someone you trust to review your proposal. Ideally, someone in your field should read it to review the substance of your proposal. It is also helpful to have someone you know to be a good writer to review it for clarity. You can look for a writing buddy or a writing workshop where you can review proposals with peers who may be going through a similar grant application process. That concludes this video about writing competitive grant proposals. Please remember to browse the linked proposal writing guide, which is a living document that provides more detailed guidance particular to JPAL proposals. We hope you found this helpful and wish you the best of luck in your future grant applications. Thank you.